She was standing in the middle of my cornfield when I pulled up, clipboard in hand, waving me over like I was a contractor who'd arrived late.
"The runway is finished,"
she said before I was fully out of the truck. "As of this morning, it's HOA managed property. You're a homeowner here, not a sovereign. The improvement clause covers this." She handed me a laminated document, Community Development Completion Notice. I looked past her at 1,800 feet of fresh black asphalt cutting diagonally through my corn. Orange cones at 20-foot intervals, no runway numbers, no edge lighting, no windsock, no markings of any kind. "Who approved this?" I said.
"Our lawyers signed off on everything. If you try to interfere, we will fine you $500 per day and place a line on this property until you comply."
I nodded slowly. I already knew two things she didn't, what that runway was missing, and who I used to be. "What's your name?" I asked. "Karen Voss," she said, chin lifted slightly. "HOA board president, 8 years running." She said it like a credential. I walked to the edge of the asphalt and stepped onto it. Ryle's Construction was stenciled on the side of the yellow excavator, still parked at the far end, engine off cab, empty. They knew how to lay pavement, I'll give them that. The surface was smooth and even edges, clean, grade, consistent. A professional job from one end to the other. That was the problem, actually. It was professional enough to look like a real runway. From the air at 500 feet, it would look exactly like one. And there was nothing on that surface, not a number, not a stripe, not a single marking to tell a pilot any different. I crouched and put my hand flat on the asphalt, still warm from the afternoon sun. "I'd like to see the FAA approval documentation for this structure," I said. Karen paused. "This is a private community airstrip," she said. "The FAA doesn't regulate those." Complete certainty. The tone of someone who had looked it up confirmed it, and was now patiently informing a difficult homeowner how the world worked. I stood up and looked northeast. 2 miles out, invisible from here, but I knew exactly where it was. The approach corridor for Hartfield Regional tracked across the landscape. Light traffic, mostly Cessnas, a few charter turboprops on instrument approaches. Consistent, regular. I had known that pattern for a long time. I had known hundreds of patterns like it across hundreds of corridors, across 31 years of a career that had nothing to do with corn. "There's an active flight path approximately 2 miles to the northeast," I said. "Aircraft fly over this field several times a week. From altitude, this surface reads as a usable landing strip. There's nothing here to indicate otherwise." Karen looked at me the way people look when they've decided you're being obstinate on purpose. "Our legal team reviewed the project thoroughly," she said. "If you have specific safety concerns, you're welcome to submit them in writing to the board." She tucked the clipboard under her arm. "In the meantime, please do not interfere with HOA property." She walked back toward the community entrance without looking back. I stayed where I was for a while. I looked at the runway, at the cones, at the Ryle's construction equipment, at the laminated notice still in my hand, the HOA letterhead, the confident language declaring that this strip of asphalt on my land, through my crop, built without my knowledge, was now community property under a clause designed to cover sidewalks and landscaping. 18 months of planning, board votes, contractor bids, construction phases, all of it moving forward, apparently without a single piece of documentation filed with the agency that governs every civil aviation structure on American soil. And the board president had just stood on my property and told me with complete settled confidence that the Federal Aviation Administration had no jurisdiction over any of it. I folded the notice and put it in my jacket pocket. There is a federal registry. It lists every approved runway in this country, the length, the surface, the lighting specifications, the approach angles, the safety buffers, every single one. Building a runway without appearing in that registry is not a zoning issue. It is not a homeowner dispute. It is a federal aviation violation. Full stop. I had spent 31 years at the agency that maintains that registry. For the last 9 of those years, I had been the one who signed the authorizations. She had no idea she'd just built an unauthorized aviation structure on the property of the one man whose signature authorizes every runway in this country. I bought the farm 3 years ago, and I want to be clear about why. Not as an investment, not as a weekend hobby. I bought 40 acres of flat Indiana farmland because I had spent 31 years inside buildings where every decision I made landed on someone else's desk within the hour, and I needed to be somewhere that when I walked outside in the morning, the only thing waiting for me was the field. I told the realtor I was a federal administrator. She smiled and moved on to the part about the drainage easements. That was fine. That was exactly how I wanted it. I grow corn. I keep a small barn with tools I'm still learning how to use properly. On weekends, I walk fence lines and fix what needs fixing. My nearest neighbor is 80 yards to the east. I have a porch. I use it. For the first time in longer than I could calculate, I was sleeping past 5:30 in the morning. What I had not fully understood when I signed the closing documents was that my 40 acres sat at the edge of the Pinecrest Commons development, 96 homes, $400 a month HOA dues, and Karen Voss. Karen had been board president for 8 years when I moved in. That is a long time to be president of anything, and the effects were visible if you knew what to look for. You could see it in the way people checked their grass height before they left for work, the way they repainted mailbox posts every spring, not because they wanted to, but because they'd learned what happened when they didn't. The way conversations at the community mailboxes tended to end quickly if someone spotted Karen's white Escalade turning the corner. She had filed liens on 14 properties in 8 years. 14. In a development of 96 homes. She had issued fines totaling, by my later count, just over $600,000 across the community. 2 families had been placed on formal payment plans after accumulated fines pushed them toward foreclosure territory. They paid. They kept their houses. They also stopped attending board meetings. Karen's position, stated openly at more than one community meeting, was that individual deed rights were subordinate to HOA governance documents. She said this without hesitation. Her board nodded. Most of the homeowners in the room had already been fined at least once, and the ones who hadn't yet didn't want to be next. So they nodded too after a moment. The machinery worked because everyone was too tired and too financially exposed to stop it. My neighbor Harold was 71 years old, a retired postal worker who had lived in Pinecrest for 11 years. He and his wife had raised 2 daughters in that house, put them both through college, and spent a considerable portion of their retirement doing exactly what I was doing, trying to have a quiet life. 2 summers before I moved in, Harold repainted his back fence. He chose a shade of tan that he thought was close enough to the approved palette. Karen's compliance inspector, she employed one which tells you something, ruled it non-compliant. The fine was $3,800 plus administrative fees. Harold told me about it one afternoon at the mailbox. He said it quietly, the way people say things they've had time to be embarrassed about, even though they have nothing to be embarrassed about. He said his wife cried when the lien notice arrived. He said he thought about fighting it. He said he didn't know how. A family on the next street then wins. Both parents working double shifts, 2 kids under 10, had a basketball hoop in their driveway. Portable, the adjustable kind, pushed to the edge near the garage. Karen sent a formal notice. The hoop constituted unauthorized recreational equipment in a common sightline. Removal within 72 hours, or a fine schedule, would begin. The Winds took it inside that same evening. Their kids played in the backyard after that. I am telling you this because the Runway did not come from nowhere. It came from 8 years of a board that had learned through consistent practice that there was no ceiling on what they could do. Karen announced the Runway project at a board meeting 18 months before my Tuesday afternoon drive home. She called it the Community's Legacy Project. A private airstrip, she said, for residents who were pilots. There were 3 in the development as far as anyone could tell. She framed it as a quality of life amenity. She ran the vote at a poorly attended meeting and got it through 5-2. She hired Riles Construction. She filed the project with the county as a paved community pathway, which is the kind of description that moves through a county permit office without much friction. County staff did flag it once, a note in the file, suggesting that aviation structures typically require federal sign-off. Karen's response to that note, as I would later discover, was to instruct Riles Construction to proceed with construction and sort out the federal documentation later. She said that in writing. I had known about the project since the announcement. I'd heard it through the HOA newsletter, a 4-page document that arrived in my mailbox every month, with the energy of a small-town propaganda outlet. I had read about the Runway plans. I had thought it was the kind of thing boards announce and then quietly let die when the budget numbers don't work. I was wrong about that. I came home one Tuesday, and there it was, 1,800 feet of finished asphalt through my cornfield. A laminated notice in Karen Voss's hand, and a confident woman explaining to me that the Federal Aviation Administration had no authority over any of it. She had no idea how long I'd been waiting to hear someone say that to my face. I gave it 30 days. That was deliberate. 30 days is a reasonable window, long enough to show good faith, short enough to establish that I wasn't going to simply absorb what had happened and move on. I spent part of that time at my desk and part of it at the county recorder's office, and by the time I was done, I had 3 things I needed: a property deed, the official county plat for the development, and a very clear understanding of exactly what had been built where. The plat was unambiguous. The runway extended 340 feet past my lot line. Not a gray area, not a question of interpretation. 340 feet of asphalt on my land, without an easement, without my consent, and without a single piece of FAA documentation on file anywhere. I wrote a letter. It was precise and it was measured, and it asked for exactly 3 things: removal of the encroaching structure within 30 days, production of the easement documentation Karen's team claimed to have finalized, and a copy of the FAA approval she had told me her lawyers had secured. I sent it certified mail with return receipt requested. I kept a copy. I noted the timestamp. 2 weeks later, Karen called an emergency board meeting and invited me to attend. I went. The community clubhouse was a rectangular room with folding chairs, arranged in a loose semicircle, and fluorescent lighting that made everyone look slightly unwell. 5 board members sat behind a folding table at the front. Karen was at the center. She had printed my letter and placed it on the table in front of her, and she had annotated it in red pen. I could see the marks from where I was sitting. There were quite a few of them. 2 neighbors sat along the side wall. I recognized one of them, a man named Dennis, who lived 3 streets over and had been at the runway dedication. He watched me come in without changing his expression. Karen waited until I sat down, then opened without preamble. "Your letter," she said, "was inappropriate and legally uninformed." She slid a document across the table toward me, a memo on law firm letterhead. I picked it up and read it while she summarized it aloud. Her HOA attorney had produced a 3-page argument that the Community Improvement Clause in the original HOA covenants granted the board authority to develop common area adjacent infrastructure for the benefit of all homeowners. The memo cited 2 previous HOA improvement projects, a repaved community road and a pergola at the clubhouse entrance as precedent. I read the memo twice. Then I set it down. "Can you show me the easement documentation on my specific parcel?" I said. "The plat puts 340 feet of that runway on my land. An improvement clause doesn't create an easement where none exists. That requires a separate recorded instrument." Karen said, "Our lawyers are finalizing that documentation." I wrote that down. "When was it expected to be finalized?" I asked. "It's being handled," she said. I wrote that down too. There was a pause. Karen filled it by reaching under the table and producing a printed schedule, which she slid across to me with the flat confidence of someone laying down a hand they were certain about. Fine schedule, $500 per day for any interference with obstruction of or unauthorized modification to HOA community infrastructure. Additionally, she said the board was authorized to seek injunctive relief in county court if I attempted to physically obstruct or damage the runway. A preliminary lien could be placed on my property within 10 business days if I did not acknowledge receipt of these terms in writing. "You can't fight a 96 homeowner community," she said. "We have the resources and the patience." I looked at the fine schedule. I looked at Karen. I thought about 31 years of meetings in rooms considerably more consequential than this one, with people who had considerably more actual authority than a homeowner association's board of directors. "2 more questions," I said. "Does the board have documentation showing FAA exemption for this structure? And has the board ever previously used the improvement clause to build aviation infrastructure?" Karen set her pen down. "Both of those questions," she said, "are outside the scope of tonight's meeting." I wrote that down. I closed my notebook, thanked the board for their time, and stood up. The room was quiet in the specific way rooms get quiet when people are trying to figure out if they've just won something. Karen's posture said she thought she had. The board member to her left was already looking down at his phone. Dennis on the side wall watched me walk to the door with an expression I couldn't quite read, not hostile but careful. I drove home with my notebook on the passenger seat. She had slid the fine schedule across the table like it was a winning hand. I wrote down every word she said that night. The morning after the board meeting, I made a list, not of grievances, not of things Karen had said that I found objectionable. A list of documents, the specific pieces of paper that would either confirm what I already suspected or tell me I had the situation wrong. I have always found it useful to start from documents rather than from conclusions. Documents don't adjust their position when you push back on them. I started at the county recorder's office. The recorder's office is a quiet place. A long counter, 2 clerks, a room in the back that smells like old paper and climate control. I have spent time in rooms like it before, though usually the documents in question covered considerably more acreage. I requested the property records for my parcel and sat down at a public terminal with a notepad. No easement on my parcel. None recorded, none pending, none in process. The deed was clean. The lot line was exactly where it had always been. Karen's lawyers had been finalizing the documentation for the better part of 18 months, and in that time, nothing had been filed, stamped, or recorded anywhere in this county. I pulled the plat map next. Official survey document, county seal lot boundaries in black ink. The runway crossed my lot line at the northeast corner and extended 340 feet onto my property. I measured it twice with the scale on the document. 340 feet, the same number I had calculated from the deed. Consistent, clean, and entirely without legal basis. I requested a copy of the original HOA covenant document. Any homeowner in the development is entitled to request it. Most people don't bother, which is precisely the condition under which boards like Karen's tend to operate. I took it to a table in the corner and read the improvement clause in full. It covered landscaping. It covered common area paving driveways, paths, the community road that ran through the center of the development. It covered shared recreational structures, which the document defined specifically as picnic shelters, playground equipment, and community seating areas. Aviation infrastructure was not mentioned. Not as an example, not as an analogy, not as a category. The word aviation did not appear in the document at all. Karen had pushed a runway project through a board vote using a covenant clause that was written to cover mulch and picnic tables. I photographed all 3 documents with my phone and drove home. That evening I opened my laptop and navigated to the FAA's Airspace Registry, a public database that lists every approved civil aviation structure in the country. Approved runways, private airstrips, helipads. If it's legal and it involves aircraft landing on it, it's in that registry. I searched by address. Nothing. I searched by coordinates. Nothing within a 2-mile radius. The runway Karen Voss had built 1,800 feet of finished asphalt, professionally graded with orange cones at 20-foot intervals, did not exist as far as every aviation authority in this country was concerned. It was invisible, a ghost strip. An aircraft approaching from the northeast, descending through a broken cloud layer on a VFR afternoon, could see it from altitude and make a decision to land on it with no information to suggest that would be a catastrophic mistake. An unauthorized aviation structure is not a zoning violation the way a fence in the wrong place is a zoning violation. There's a specific federal statute that governs the construction of aviation infrastructure. The reasoning is straightforward. Aircraft don't stop at county lines, and the people inside them don't have time at 120 knots on short final to determine whether the runway below them has the correct permits. I sat with that for a while. Harold caught me at the mailbox on a Thursday afternoon, about a week after the recorder's office visit. He came across the yard with his hands in his jacket pockets, the way people do when they have something to say and aren't sure how it will land. "She filed on 14 of us," he said without preamble. 14 families in 8 years. Most people don't even know they can fight it. They just pay. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded sheet of paper, a copy of his lien notice, the one for the fence paint. $3,800 plus fees. He held it out to me. I took it and looked at it. County seal, HOA letterhead, his name and address at the top, the violation description below, and a payment schedule at the bottom, with 2 options. Pay in full within 30 days, or enter a structured installment arrangement that would take 14 months. For tan fence paint. Nobody fights back, Harold said, because nobody can afford to. I photographed the document and handed it back to him. "Have you talked to an attorney?" I asked. He gave me the look of a man who has thought about a question many times and arrived at the same answer each time. Attorney costs money I don't have, and even if I won, she'd just find something else. I nodded. I understood the mechanism. It wasn't about any individual fine. It was about the accumulation of exposure, the knowledge that there was always something else she could find, always another clause, always another compliance notice sitting in a drawer somewhere with your name on it. I made a few calls, I said, to some people I know, the kind of people who answer quickly. Harold looked at me. I didn't elaborate. I walked back to my farmhouse and stood at the kitchen window, looking at the runway in my field, at the cones, at the absence of markings, at the gap where a windsock should have been. This had stopped being a property dispute the moment they poured asphalt in controlled airspace. They just didn't know it yet. The letter arrived on a Monday. Not a new letter. A revised accounting of an existing situation. That's how I would describe it. Karen had gone back to the date of my certified letter, the one requesting easement documentation and FAA approval, and reclassified it retroactively as formal interference with HOA community infrastructure. Under that reclassification, the $500 per day fine schedule she had presented at the board meeting applied from that date forward. 30 days of certified letter sitting unresolved. 30 days at $500 per day, $15,000. A preliminary lien notice filed with the county that same week was attached as a courtesy. I read the letter at my kitchen table. I set it down. I made coffee. I added the letter to the folder I had been building since the morning after the board meeting, certified mail receipts, plat copies, the covenant document, my notes from the meeting, Karen's fine schedule. The folder was getting thick. I considered that a good sign. 3 days after the lien notice, Karen called a community meeting. I know what was said because Harold attended and told me afterward, and because 2 other neighbors I had come to know mentioned it independently in separate conversations, with the specific tone people use when they are relaying something they found distasteful, but felt I needed to hear. Karen addressed more than 60 homeowners that evening. She named me by name. She told the room that I was blocking community progress, that I was acting against the interests of 96 families, and that my refusal to acknowledge the legitimacy of the Runway project was holding the entire community back from moving forward on additional improvement plans. She said I had sent a letter full of legal threats designed to intimidate the board, and that the board had responded appropriately by enforcing the terms every homeowner had agreed to when they moved in. Several people nodded. 2 stood up and said something supportive. Harold told me their names. I didn't write them down. I understood why they did it. They had their own fines to worry about, their own lien exposure, their own calculations to make about where to put themselves in a room when Karen Voss was taking attendance. I wasn't at the meeting. I was home. I didn't know it had happened until the following morning. What I did know was that the folder on my kitchen table was growing, and that Karen had just added to it. A community meeting where a board president names a specific homeowner by name and characterizes a certified legal letter as an act of obstruction, that is a documented event. It was in the meeting minutes. Harold had a copy. I asked him to get me one. The incident happened on a Thursday afternoon, 11 days after the lien notice. I was in the barn when I heard it, a single-engine aircraft lower than usual, the pitch of the engine changing in a way that suggested a descent configuration. Not unusual in itself. The regional approach corridor runs northeast of my property, and light aircraft pass over several times a week. But this one was closer, and the engine note had the particular quality of something being flown carefully. The way you fly when you're evaluating a surface. I came out of the barn and looked east. A Cessna 172 white, with a blue stripe standard flight school livery, was on a low final approach to the runway. 400 feet above ground level, maybe less. Gear fixed, flaps extended, lined up clean on the center line of Karen's asphalt strip. The instructor in the left seat was doing what any experienced pilot does when an unfamiliar strip presents itself from altitude. He was looking for the things that tell you whether it's safe to land. There were no numbers at the threshold, no centerline stripe, no edge lighting, no windsock, nothing that a certified airstrip is required by regulation to display. At approximately 400 feet, the pilot applied power. The nose came up. The aircraft climbed away to the north, turned left, and disappeared behind the tree line. I stood in my yard and watched it go. My neighbor across the road, a woman named Terry, who I had spoken to perhaps 4 times in 3 years, had been on her front porch during the whole sequence. She had filmed it on her phone, the way people film things that look unusual, without fully knowing why. 48 seconds of video. The approach, the low, pass, the go-around. The runway clearly visible in the frame, unmarked and unlit, looking for all the world like an active private airstrip. She brought it to me that evening, holding her phone out with the expression of someone who has just understood something she wishes she hadn't. I watched it twice. I thanked her. I asked if she would be willing to share a copy with me. She said yes immediately, with the energy of someone who wanted the thing off her phone, and in the hands of someone who knew what to do with it. I did. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time that night. The video was on my phone. The folder was open in front of me. County plat, deed, HOA covenant, registry search results, board meeting notes, fine ledger, lien notice, community meeting minutes, Herald's lien copy. And now, 48 seconds of a flight school Cessna breaking off a low approach to an unmarked, unregistered asphalt strip in active airspace. This was no longer a matter of property lines and improvement clauses. A pilot had made an approach to that runway, not hypothetically, not as a thought experiment. A real aircraft with a real instructor and presumably a student in the right seat had descended to 400 feet above my field because the surface below them looked like somewhere they could land. They had aborted because there was nothing there to confirm it was safe. The next pilot might not abort. The next pilot might be a student flying solo for the first time, lower on fuel than he should be, looking for any flat surface that presented itself. I thought about that for a while. Then I picked up my phone. I didn't call the county. I didn't call a lawyer. I didn't call my HOA liaison, or a local news station, or anyone who would have moved through the appropriate channels at the appropriate pace, while Karen filed additional liens and held additional community meetings. I opened my contacts and found the number I had not dialed in 8 months. Not since the retirement dinner. Not since the handover briefing. Not since the last morning I had driven into that building in Washington, with a badge that opened every door on every floor. The call was answered on the second ring. I said my name. I said my title. I said, I need a formal inspection initiated under federal statute. I have documentation of an unauthorized aviation structure in active airspace, an unregistered runway, and a recorded near-miss incident. I need a team on site. The voice on the other end said, we'll have a team dispatched within 2 weeks. I said thank you and ended the call. I looked out the kitchen window at the runway cutting through my field. The orange cones were just visible in the last of the daylight, small and orderly, and completely unaware of what was coming. I made one phone call that afternoon. Not to a lawyer, not to the county. I called Washington. The county court ruling arrived on a Thursday. It was a preliminary ruling, not a final judgment, not a full adjudication of the encroachment claim, just a procedural determination that the lien on my property was valid, pending full dispute proceedings. Karen's attorney had filed a motion to confirm it. The court had confirmed it. That was the entirety of what had happened. Karen treated it as a complete and total victory. Her attorney sent a letter to my address that same afternoon. The language was measured in the way legal letters are measured, but the subtext was not subtle. The board's position had been validated. My objections had been addressed through proper channels, and any further interference with HOA community infrastructure would result in accelerated enforcement of the existing fine schedule. I read it, standing at the mailbox, folded it in half and put it in the folder. The folder was very thick now. The following Saturday, Karen organized what she called a runway dedication. I want to be precise about that term because she used it in the invitation, an actual printed invitation cardstock, distributed to all 96 households in the development. The Pinecrest Commons Community Airstrip Dedication Ceremony, Saturday, 2 p.m. Light refreshments provided. She had rented folding tables. There was lemonade and a tray of cookies from the grocery store bakery. Someone had made a banner, white vinyl printed text, zip-tied to 2 wooden stakes driven into the grass at the edge of the runway. Pinecrest Community Airstrip for our neighbors who fly. A man I didn't recognize was moving through the crowd with a camera, the kind with a long lens that suggested either a serious hobby or a professional assignment. I later found out he wrote for a local community news blog that covered HOA events, school board meetings, and the occasional business opening. Karen was in a blazer. Navy well-pressed, the kind of blazer people wear when they want to be taken seriously at an outdoor event. She was moving through the crowd with the ease of someone who had just won something and wanted to make sure everyone understood that. At approximately 2:15, she called for attention. I was standing at the back fence of my property on my side of the lot line with a cup of coffee. I had considered not coming. I had thought about staying on my porch and letting the event proceed without me as an audience. But there was something about the invitation, the cardstock, the banner, the community news blog photographer, that suggested this was being staged for a record, and I wanted to be part of that record. Not loudly, just present. Karen spoke for about 8 minutes. I won't reconstruct all of it, but the relevant portion went approximately as follows. The Runway project had been undertaken for the benefit of the community. It had proceeded through proper channels. The board had addressed all legal challenges appropriately, and the project was now complete and fully operational. She said, and I want to be precise here, because she said it clearly to 60+ people, with a photographer present, that the runway had been reviewed and fully approved under all applicable regulations. She paused for effect. Then she added, "The FAA does not regulate private community airstrips under a certain size. We checked. Everything is in order." She said it with the finality of someone reading from a prepared statement. The crowd applauded. I drank my coffee. A neighbor I knew slightly, a man named Paul, who lived 2 streets north and had been friendly toward me at the mailbox, walked over and stood beside me at the fence. He watched the crowd for a moment. "Are you just going to let her do this?" he said quietly. I looked at my phone, then back at the crowd. Karen was posing for a photograph next to the runway banner. Navy blazer lemonade in one hand, the other gesturing toward the asphalt. The photographer was crouching slightly to get the banner in the frame. Karen was smiling with the specific satisfaction of someone who has fought a battle and believes they have won it. She was standing on an unauthorized federal aviation structure. She was being photographed next to it. She was publicly declaring, on the record, that it had been approved by an agency whose registry showed no record of it whatsoever. Every word she said was going into the community news blog. Every photograph was going to have a timestamp. The banner would be in the background of every shot. I thought about the 2-person compliance team that had flown in from the regional office the previous afternoon. I thought about the motel 12 miles east where they had checked in. I thought about the federal inspection order that had been initiated, logged, and assigned 3 weeks prior from an office in Washington. "No," I said to Paul. He looked at me. I put my phone in my pocket and finished my coffee. I drove back to my farmhouse and sat on the porch. The field was quiet. The runway was visible from the porch if I looked northeast, a dark line through the dry corn, the orange cones catching the late afternoon light. The banner was too far away to read from here, but I knew what it said. "For our neighbors who fly." I thought about the Cessna 172 that had broken off its approach at 400 feet 3 weeks ago. I thought about the instructor in the left seat, who had looked down at an unmarked asphalt strip and made the correct professional decision to go around. I thought about the student who had been in the right seat watching him do it, learning what that decision looks like. I thought about Karen in her navy blazer, holding a glass of lemonade, telling 60 people that everything was in order. I checked my phone one more time. She raised her glass and announced the runway was open for community use. I checked my phone. The inspection team would arrive in 3 days. They arrived on a Wednesday morning. A white government SUV, clean and unremarkable with federal plates, and 2 men in the front seat who had the particular posture of people accustomed to arriving at places where they are not expected. They parked at the entrance to the runway and got out without hurrying. Both wore FAA identification on lanyards, the kind of credentials that are designed to be seen from a distance. One carried a clipboard. The other carried a hard-shell case and a camera with a wide-angle lens. I watched from my kitchen window while the coffee brewed. Karen came out of her house 8 minutes after they arrived. She had put on a blazer, not the navy one from the dedication, a gray one, and she was walking with the purposeful stride of someone who has handled difficult situations before and expects to handle this one the same way. She was smiling. The cooperative smile of a board president who has just won a preliminary court ruling and considers herself to be operating from a position of strength. She introduced herself. HOA board president, 8 years. She began to explain the community airstrip project, the board, vote, the contractor, the county pathway permit, the community support. She spoke at a measured pace, the way people speak when they want to appear thorough. The lead inspector let her finish. Then he opened his clipboard, removed a document, and handed it to her without a word. 3 pages, FAA letterhead. The header read, Notice of Federal Aviation Violation. The body cited 49 U.S.C. Section 40,103 Federal Authority over Navigable Airspace. It cited 49 U.S.C. Section 44,701 Safety Regulations Governing Civil Aviation Structures. It cited FAA Advisory Circular 150/5300-13A, which governs airport design standards. It described the specific violations: unauthorized aviation structure, constructed without FAA approval, located within a controlled airspace corridor, lacking required safety lighting, threshold markings, centerline striping, clearance buffers, and windsock equipment. It noted a documented near-miss incident, supported by 48 seconds of video evidence submitted to the federal file. At the bottom of the third page under the heading, Initiating Authority, was a name, my name, and below it, Director, Federal Aviation Administration. Karen read it. I watched her read it. I saw the exact moment her eyes reached the bottom of the page, because her chin dropped approximately half an inch, and she went very still. She read it again. Slower this time. Then she looked up. I was standing at the fence line of my farm hands in my jacket pockets watching her. I had been there for about 4 minutes. She had not noticed me until that moment. That's, she said. She stopped. He's just a homeowner. The lead inspector looked at her steadily. He's the director of the Federal Aviation Administration, ma'am, he said. He initiated this investigation personally. What happened in the next 40 minutes I will try to describe accurately because it matters. Karen took 3 steps backward and made a phone call. She turned away from the inspector and spoke in a low, urgent voice, with her free hand pressed flat against her thigh. I could not hear the words, but I recognized the cadence. It was the cadence of someone who has just called their attorney and is being told things they do not want to hear. At one point, she said audibly, "But the county approved the pathway permit." There was a pause. Then she said nothing for a long time while she listened. Board member Dennis, who had seconded the runway motion at the original vote, had come out of his house when he saw the government vehicle. He was standing on the sidewalk 20 feet from Karen when the inspector spoke. When he heard the words Director, Federal Aviation Administration, he took 3 steps backward, not dramatically, just quietly, the way people step back when they have been standing too close to something that is about to fall. I told her we needed to check on the permits, he said, not to anyone in particular, just into the air. Board member Patrice arrived 2 minutes later. She took out her phone and began filming. Then she seemed to reconsider, looked at the federal credentials on the inspector's lanyard, and put the phone in her pocket. The inspectors worked methodically. They photographed the threshold. They measured the clearance zone with a laser tool. They documented the absence of edge lighting, the absence of threshold numbers, the absence of a windsock. The lead inspector crouched at the runway surface and photographed the point where the asphalt crossed my lot line. The same 340 feet confirmed by the county plat, now confirmed again by a federal measuring instrument with a case number attached to it. The second inspector opened his laptop and cross-referenced the file. He read aloud to his colleague, not to Karen, just to his colleague the way people read aloud when they're confirming documentation. A line from an email Karen had sent to Riles Construction during the planning phase. Skip the federal permits. We'll deal with that later. Karen was still on the phone. She heard her own words. I watched her eyes close for a moment. She ended the call. She turned to me. I had walked to the edge of my property by then, not onto the runway, just to the lot line. She looked at me with an expression I had not seen on her before. Not the entitlement, not the authority, not the careful confidence of 8 years running a community by force of accumulated pressure. Something else, something that had not had time to harden into anything useful yet. You could have just talked to us, she said. I looked at her for a moment. I sent a certified letter, I said. I attended your board meeting. I asked for easement documentation you never produced. I asked for FAA approval documents that didn't exist. I gave you 30 days. I paused. You told me the Federal Aviation Administration doesn't regulate private airstrips. She didn't say anything. You said that in front of your entire board, I said, and then you said it again in front of 60 homeowners and a photographer. From behind me I heard a sound, slow, deliberate clapping. I turned. Harold was standing on the sidewalk in his jacket, hands coming together with the careful rhythm of someone who has been waiting a long time to do exactly this. Just Harold alone, clapping. After a moment, Terry joined him from across the road, then Paul from the end of the block. Karen did not look at them. I turned and walked back to my farmhouse. I did not look back either. The formal orders came by certified mail, which I found appropriate. The FAA issued its enforcement package 3 weeks after the inspection, a cease and desist, a mandatory removal order, and a federal fine assessment of $180,000. The breakdown covered 3 categories: unauthorized aviation structure, active airspace, safety hazard, and controlled airspace violation. The HOA had 45 days to retain a certified demolition contractor and remove every inch of the runway at their own expense. The order was not a suggestion. It was not a negotiating position. It was a federal directive with a compliance deadline and a case number. The county court received a copy of the FAA enforcement documentation the following week. The preliminary lien on my property, the one Karen had celebrated as a validation of her position, was vacated with prejudice. My retroactive fines, all $15,000 of them, were voided in the same order. My legal costs, modest as they were reimbursed as part of the lien reversal ruling. I read each document at my kitchen table. I added them to the folder. Then I moved the folder to a drawer, because I no longer needed it on the table. Karen's personal situation was by all accounts considerably more complicated. Her attorney, the same one who had produced the improvement clause memo, called her the week after the enforcement order arrived to explain that the email she had sent to Riles Construction, the one that said, "Skip the federal permits, we'll deal with that later," had been formally entered into the federal investigation file. That email established individual decision-making authority over the permit question. HOA board liability insurance covers the board acting in good faith within its authority. It does not cover a board president who explicitly directed a contractor to bypass federal regulations in writing. I did not hear this conversation. I learned the general outline of it through Harold, who had it from a neighbor whose husband was on the board, which is how information moves in a development of 96 houses. What I know for certain is that Karen retained a separate personal attorney approximately 10 days after the enforcement order arrived, and that the HOA's special assessment notice went out to all homeowners that same week. $1,875 per household, mandatory, to cover the cost of the runway removal and the federal penalty, due within 60 days. 96 families, billed for a runway most of them never asked for, built on land that was never the HOA's to use, approved by an agency whose jurisdiction Karen had publicly dismissed at a community event with a photographer present. The emergency board meeting was called 12 days after the inspection. I was not invited, which was fine. I had no interest in attending. What I know about what happened inside that room, I learned from Harold, who attended, and from the official minutes that were distributed to all homeowners the following week. The vote to remove Karen from the board presidency was 7-1. The one dissenting vote was Karen's own. Within the month, 3 additional board members who had publicly supported the runway project resigned. They sent individual letters of resignation to the development's management company. None of the letters mentioned the runway specifically. They used phrases like personal reasons and time constraints and family commitments, which I understood and did not begrudge. The interim board that took over had a mandate from the homeowner: vote audit every fine and lien issued under the previous administration. Harold's $3,800 lien, the one for the fence, paint, the one his wife had cried over, was among the first reviewed. It was found to be procedurally defective. The compliance inspector's ruling had not followed the correct notification sequence required by the HOA's own bylaws. The lien was formally removed. Harold called me when he found out. He didn't say much. He didn't need to. 2 neighbors who had stood up at Karen's community meeting to support the runway project came to me separately on different days and apologized. One of them brought a plate of food. I thanked them both and meant it. I understood the position they had been in. Fear is a reasonable response to 8 years of targeted enforcement, and it doesn't make someone a bad person. The demolition crew arrived on a Tuesday morning. I noticed that when I came out to the porch with my coffee, same day of the week I had first come home to find the runway already there, same low October light, same smell of dry corn and cooling air. 3 men in work gear, a bobcat, skid steer, and a concrete saw mounted on a flatbed. They set up at the far end of the runway and began working their way toward my property line. I sat on the porch and watched. The saw cut the asphalt into sections. The skid steer lifted each section and loaded it onto the flatbed. The work was efficient and unhurried. Strip by strip, section by section, the asphalt came up and was carried away. No ceremony, no banner, just machinery doing what it was told. 3 hours after they started, the last section came up. I walked out to the field. The ground underneath was dark and undisturbed. The asphalt had been laid directly over the soil, without a base layer. I could see the impression of the surface, the slight compression from the weight and the heat. But underneath that, the earth was intact. It had held. Whatever had been placed on top of it, the ground underneath, had simply waited. I crouched down and picked up a handful. It was cold and dense, and it smelled right. The particular smell of Indiana soil in the fall. Iron and organic matter, and the memory of everything that had grown in it. I let it fall through my fingers. Then I stood up, went to the barn, got my seed spreader, and started working my way down the line. The soil underneath was fine. Some things just go back to what they were always supposed to be.